Right, here we're looking at the United States in the 1970s, and we're starting with the person who was in office at the opening of the 1970s. President Richard Nixon was elected to office in 1968 and then again in 1972. We're going to start off with writing assignment number 15, which has 7 questions in total. You're going to start off by reading a section in the textbook called Mobilizing the Silent Majority. And you're going to be answering these 2 questions, describing the silent majority, and then President Nixon's approach to tapping into the silent majority. So what we're looking at is in the wake of the civil rights movement and then growing resistance movements, including the anti-war movement, you have a conservative backlash in the United States, right? A backlash is like a repercussion, a consequence, a response or reaction to something major happening. So there was conservative anger in the United States at the major civil rights changes. So as much as this wave of kind of progressive, conscious-raising activism was sweeping the country in order to address the issues of racism and deal with the inequalities of segregation, voter restrictions. Of course, like we've seen in every situation where there is any kind of major change, there is a resistance to that, right? And so the resistance that came to this kind of progressive change came from those who saw that their privileges and their rights were under attack, right? And so you have largely, initially, white Southern Democrats who were seeing the threats to the stronghold they had in the South, starting from the end of Reconstruction, devolving into kind of this huge, to them, chaos of this transition from the life they had known, where it was very clear who had power, it was very clear everyone's place in society, and it was an unthreatened, white supremacy in the South. As, people are purposely breaking the laws in order to highlight how unjust they were, as you have like anger at the slowness of the change, sparking riots and protests all across the country, there were leaders who seized upon this resistance to change and began to use the call for law and order. We need law and order. And this is not something new. This is still something that is used to, temper and to tamp down and to quiet voices that are, calling for change. So in 1961, 65, and 67, in the midst of the civil rights movement, you had the president issue executive orders for what was called affirmative action. The U.S. needs to take affirmative action to address the inequalities that stem from racism and white supremacy in the United States, right? And also patriarchy, right? Is that you have affirmative action was essentially addressing the fact that it was white men who have been given a lot of privileges, and in many cases exclusive privilege, to have access to opportunities and resources. And so the affirmative action that these executive orders prompted was that there needs to be action taken to change how exclusive the workplace is, how exclusive the halls of government are, meaning making an attempt to bring in women, to bring in non-white people, to diversify places that were nearly completely dominated by white men. Then you had in 1971, after all of the court cases and the changes in law about segregation, even though segregation was against the law in terms of schooling, the reality is, and you saw a video on this, redlining and other practices had already kind of, de facto segregated our society, because you have generations of, racist policies, you had neighborhoods that were exclusively white. You had neighborhoods that were exclusively black. You had neighborhoods that were exclusively non-white, right? And it's very hard to just suddenly shift the demographics of neighborhoods without taking some corrective action. And so busing was introduced as a way to deal with this, a way to mix up the school populations in spite of the fact that housing was already segregated, right? So if you have an all-white community, how are you going to have the schools not be all white? And so busing was the idea of taking some kids from one neighborhood and bringing them to another. Well, this brought about a lot of protest, right? Especially from white parents who were like, no, I worked hard. I want this neighborhood that we live in. I want my kids to be able to go to the school. And a big part of what made the neighborhood appealing was that it was an all-white neighborhood, right? You had this conservative backlash against affirmative action, against desegregation, have a very notedly religious, in other words, Protestant Christian, very patriotic, pro-USA, anti-communist, anti-union, anti-social welfare program rhetoric that was couched in this what was called plain folk Americanism. Well, we're just plain American folks, and we just want, a simple life and the rights that we've always known and the privileges we've always known. We don't want all this change and chaos and mixing up with all these, new scary words and terms and ideas. There was this, and that drew a lot of support. There were a lot of people who felt like the changes that were happening in the United States were too many, too fast, and they were disrupting really the stability and the privilege that many people had known and did not want to lose. You also had these media culture wars, right, and academic culture wars, in the sense of kind of people introducing like these new liberation movements, these new progressive ways, and then you had a conservative backlash saying, no, this is not our way, and we don't want these new ways. We want to go back to the way things were before, right? So here's a photograph of an anti-race mixing rally, and some of the signs in the back say race mixing is communism. So kind of people were really pulling together kind of really unrelated, like technically unrelated ideas, but kind of there were political leaders that were drawing on people's fear of communism during the Cold War, and then making the argument that all of these changes were un-American and therefore backed by communism, right? It was like a little bit of mental gymnastics there of pulling together ideas, all of which, like, okay, so this base group of people hate all of these things or are afraid of all of these things, to kind of mix them all together. You also had, not only in the South, outside the South, here's a photograph from a white rights rally in Boston in the 1970s in response to busing, right? And so you had people saying, what about white people's rights? And that hasn't gone away. And a big part of it is perhaps maybe in what you've learned in class this semester, you can kind of see how this idea of white rights, because white privilege has been so ingrained in so much of the law and the structures of American society from the very beginning, it becomes invisible, right? And then when someone is pushing for a change to that in terms of letting other people in so that they can have the same access, now it's seen as an oppression to the group that had held all the privilege all that time, right? And so a well-known quote, right, is that when you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So people have been so accustomed to, like, well, yeah, we have always had access to this, or we were the only ones that had access to this, or we're making our choices of what we want to do, but not looking at the structure that has not allowed other people those choices, right? See this as an attack on them. Some other groups that were building momentum for movements during this time. This is the time when we see a major shift in LGBTQ or LGBT movements. You have, for most of U.S. history, and in most, especially European-dominated places, and European colonized places for the past 500 years, queer people have faced criminalization, discrimination, and pathologization. Sorry about that. They've been pathologized. But what I mean by that is that in the United States, it was against the law to be gay, or what was called homosexual, right? It was against the law to be trans, or what was called cross-dressing. And it was legal to discriminate against people. It was legal to deny people basic human rights like housing, like medical care. And so when we get around to the time of the civil rights movement, you have a growing number of people saying, well, we can't keep living like this, right? This is where we get the term "in the closet," is people could not legally be out. They could not be gay, lesbian, trans, and out, or bisexual and out. They had to keep it hidden, or they would lose their jobs. They could be evicted from their housing. They could lose their children. Lots of ways that punishment came to those who were outed themselves or were outed. So there were different groups of people working to try and gain some kind of access to rights, to proper treatment, to stability. There were some groups, especially white gay men groups, that were called homophile groups, that were organizing to look for acceptance and wanting to assimilate into society. So that's kind of on the most tame end, right? Like trying to prove that, oh, we're not, mentally ill, we're not deranged, we're not pedophiles, right? Like this, trying to convince the general public that we're people, right? Like that we're people, and there's not any more horrible people within this group than there are in the general public, right? So on that end, looking for acceptance. And then on the other end, you have people participating in acts of resistance and saying, no, I don't want to have to conform to what mainstream society says is right in order to just get basic human decency and basic human rights. So people were doing acts of resistance, and part of the acts of resistance was really just being openly LGBT, right? Like just being openly like, yes, I am this or that. And that was a resistance instead of, trying to hide it and trying to fly below the radar. So some initial major acts of resistance that are going to start the movement during this time. In 1959 in Los Angeles, a place called Cooper's Donuts. So in the United States, being gay was against the law. Gay people congregating in gay bars or gay dances was against the law. People, what we consider cross-dressing, dressing against gender norms, right? Like, so what a man is supposed to dress like and a woman is supposed to dress like in our society. If you go against that, then you can be arrested, right? And so Cooper's Donuts was a place, and so a lot of the gay community, I mean, they exist, right? LGBT folks don't just not exist. They've always existed. So they really had no space where they could just be, to be with, their partners, to be in their community, to be openly who they are. So you had after hours places, or places that were after closing time, places like that became gay bars or gay discos. And so Cooper's Donuts was one of these places. Well, the LAPD Vice Squad, right? So the Vice Squad of different police departments dealt with racketeering and gambling and prostitution, the things that were considered vice, like drugs, narcotics, that were vice, but homosexuality was one of the vices that the Vice Squad would deal with. And they would go and try and find these people and bust these places and do mass arrests of people who were, like, you had a place where men were dancing with men, or people were, quote unquote, cross-dressing. They would be arrested. And the LAPD Vice Squad would do these busts. So Cooper's Donuts was one of these places, and one night, they were very used to being targeted by the police. One night, the LAPD did a bust at Cooper's Donuts, but in 1959, the people fought back against being arrested, right? And it kind of laid the groundwork for other similar events where people started saying, no, why should we're not doing anything really wrong, right? By just congregating and